The prairie stretched wide and empty, golden grass swaying beneath a late summer sky. The sun rode low, burning orange, and the faint sound of cicadas buzzed against the hush of the land. Elias McGraw stood on the porch of his weathered ranch house, his hands rough and calloused, gripping the railing like a man trying to steady himself against a storm that hadn't yet come. He had fought cattle thieves, droughts, and dust storms, but nothing rattled him like this day, the day he would meet his bride. For years, Elias had lived alone. The townsfolk of Red Rock called him the Ghost Rancher, a man too cold and too scarred for company. They remembered how his fiancée had died before their wedding, how Elias withdrew after burying himself in cattle and silence. But loneliness had a way of gnawing at a man's bones, no matter how tough he pretended to be, so he'd done something desperate, something he never imagined for himself. He'd written to a mail-order bride agency in St. Louis. A woman named Margaret Finch, young, respectable, had answered. Her letters were neat, polite, filled with promises of companionship and the skills to keep a ranch house warm and orderly. Elias had read those words 100 times, imagining the voice that wrote them. Now the wagon was due. Any hour. Elias adjusted the collar of his shirt, one of the only ones without patches, and checked the house once more. The floors were swept, the hearth cleaned, the spare room readied. He'd even placed wildflowers in a jar on the table, though his big hands had clumsily snapped half their stems. Judith Parker, his elderly neighbor from down the valley, had stopped by earlier with biscuits and a word of warning. "You'll scare her off if you don't soften that hard face, Elias," she'd said, wagging a finger. "I ain't trying to scare nobody," he muttered. "Then let her see the man beneath all that rough," Judith replied. "Don't hide behind silence." He thought of that now as he poured himself a tin cup of coffee. His heart drummed heavy. Louder than the ticking of the clock on the mantel. From the ridge road came the faint creak of wagon wheels. Elias froze. Dust rose on the horizon, shimmering in the late light. The moment had come. He straightened his back, tugged at his vest, and stepped off the porch. The wagon lumbered closer, drawn by 2 tired mules. But as it rolled to a halt before the ranch gate, Elias's breath caught not from joy, but confusion. A woman climbed down, her face framed by strands of brown hair loosened from her bonnet. She was no Margaret Finch. This woman's dress was plain, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion. And behind her, 5 children tumbled out of the wagon, boys and girls of varying ages, clutching bundles, clutching each other. The oldest, a tall boy with sharp eyes, stood protectively at the woman's side. The smallest, no more than 3, clung to her skirt with both fists. Elias's heart sank. This wasn't what he had prepared for. The woman stepped forward, her voice trembling but strong. "Sir, I'm Clara Dawson. I know this isn't what you expected. There's been a mistake at the agency." She swallowed hard, glancing back at the children. "But I had nowhere else to go. Please, just let us rest here until I can find work." Elias's jaw tightened. The dust, the silence, the weight of 5 pairs of young eyes staring at him, it all pressed heavy. This was supposed to be the end of his loneliness, not the beginning of chaos. He looked past her to the wide prairie, as if searching for an answer out there in the fading sun for the first time in years. Elias McGrath wasn't sure if his ranch was big enough for the storm that had just arrived at his gate. The dust had barely settled around the wagon when silence fell heavy over the ranch yard. Elias McGrath stood rooted in place, every muscle stiff, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. 5 children. Not 1, not 2, 5. And the woman, this Clara Dawson, was not the bright-eyed Margaret Finch whose letters had promised to step into his life like sunlight through a dusty window. Clara Dawson's eyes met his. Steady, though rimmed with fatigue. She wasn't timid. She wasn't smiling. She wasn't trying to charm him. She looked like a woman who had weathered too many storms and was standing only because her children needed her. "Mr. McGrath," she said again, her voice firm despite the tremor beneath. "There's been a mistake. The agency promised me a position as a housekeeper for a widower with steady work. They gave me your name, your ranch, your address. When I learned it wasn't the same arrangement I expected." She glanced at her children, her words tightening. It was already too late to turn back. "I had no choice but to come." The eldest boy, Samuel, stepped closer to his mother, his eyes narrowing at Elias. His hands were clenched at his sides, ready to fight if he had to. He was only 15, but Elias could see the man already etched in his jaw, the protector in his stance. Beside him, Lasitz, slender and solemn, held her little brother Jacob's hand. Ben, the wiry 9-year-old, craned his neck, openly sizing up the ranch, the corral, the livestock. Emily, the 6-year-old, clung shyly to her mother's skirts, peeking out at Elias with wide, fearful eyes. It wasn't the picture Elias had waited for. Not by a long stretch. "You've come to the wrong place," Elias said, his voice low and edged with steel. "I sent for a bride, not a housekeeper. Not a—" He caught himself before the word burden escaped his lips. Clara's chin lifted. "I am no burden, Mr. McGrath. I can cook, clean, mend, sow, tend gardens, and teach my children myself. I don't ask for charity. I only ask for a roof until I can earn enough to provide for them." Her words struck harder than Elias wanted to admit. Her pride, her refusal to beg it, reminded him of himself. Years ago, when tragedy had hollowed him out but he had refused to bow. The moment stretched taut, broken only when Ben darted away from the wagon to chase a stray chicken across the yard. Feathers flew as the bird squawked, and Elias swore under his breath. The boy laughed like mischief itself, until Samuel barked, "Ben," and yanked him back in line. Elias rubbed the bridge of his nose, the headache starting already. 5 children, Lord have mercy. Clara squared her shoulders. If you turn us away, we'll sleep in that wagon. But understand this, Mr. McGraw will not let my children starve. Her words hung in the air like a challenge. Elias thought of Judith Parker's warning that very morning, don't hide behind silence. He thought of the townsfolk, who'd be grinning and gossiping if they caught wind of this fiasco. And he thought of the empty rooms in his ranch house, swept clean, waiting for a woman who would never come. His voice came out rough, reluctant. "One night, that's all. You and your youngins can stay one night." Clara gave the smallest nod, as if she had expected no more. "One night will do." The children bustled, hauling their few bundles from the wagon. Lucy helped Emily, whispering soothing words to calm her fear. Samuel carried the heaviest sacks, his eyes never leaving Elias, like a wolf watching a stranger too close to his den. Jacob toddled behind, tripping twice before Lucy caught him, and Ben, quick as a whip, nearly dropped a bundle because he was too busy staring at Elias's rifle hung by the door. Elias led them inside, every step of their presence pressing against the silence that had once been his only companion. Clara paused at the threshold, her eyes sweeping over the freshly swept floor, the jar of wildflowers on the table, the neat stack of firewood by the hearth. For a moment, a softness flickered across her face. "You prepared for someone," she said quietly. Elias's jaw tightened. "Not for you." Her gaze didn't falter. "No, not for me. But life doesn't often give us what we expect, Mr. McGraw." That night, as the children settled onto makeshift bedding in the spare room, Elias sat alone by the dying fire. He listened to the faint murmur of Clara's voice, steady and gentle as she told her children a bedtime prayer. It carried down the hall, filling the emptiness of his house with a warmth he didn't know whether to welcome or push away. Elias stared into the embers. This wasn't the life he ordered, nor the woman he waited for. But the truth pressed in on him like the prairie wind. Clara Dawson and her brood weren't going anywhere, icily. And for the first time in years, the silence in Elias McGraw's home was broken. The morning after Clara Dawson and her children arrived, Elias McGrath woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. Laughter. At first, he thought it a dream. But when he opened his eyes, the racket was real. Running feet, banging doors, a rooster crowing madly after being chased by a boy with too much energy. Elias swung his boots to the floor, muttering curses under his breath. By the time he stepped into the yard, Ben had climbed halfway up the corral fence, waving a stick like a saber, hollering at Jacob to charge the chickens. Emily shrieked on in fear, but in Delitas feathers filled the air. "Samuel," Clara's voice cut sharp from the doorway. "Get your brother down before he breaks his neck." Samuel obeyed, but not without glaring at Elias. That boy had eyes like flint, cold and watchful, as though Elias himself were the enemy. Elias rubbed the back of his neck. He'd agreed to one night, but Clara had quietly set about cooking breakfast in his kitchen like she'd been doing it for years. The smell of biscuits and bacon drifted out, and the sound of a hymn hummed under Clara's breath softened the edges of the chaos. Still, Elias's jaw locked tight. His ranch wasn't built for this. His life wasn't built for this. By midday, the trouble only grew. Ben left the barn door open, and 2 cows wandered out. Lucy knocked over a water bucket trying to carry it for her mother. Jacob tripped into a mud puddle so deep he looked more hog than boy by the time Clara yanked him out. Elias snapped more than once, his voice booming across the yard. "Close that gate. Don't touch that saw. Boy, for the love of mercy, quiet down before you scare the stock half to death." But every time, Clara met his temper with calm steadiness. "They're children, Mr. McGrath. They'll learn." Her patience rattled him worse than the noise. That evening, after supper, Elias retreated to the barn, needing the solitude of the horses. He ran a brush down the flank of his chestnut mare, the steady motion quieting the storm in his head. That's when he noticed the corner of a folded letter sticking from Clara's trunk. She'd left it in the tack room, tucked behind their few travel-worn belongings. Elias wasn't a man to snoop, but something in him, a mix of suspicion and pride, drove his hand forward. He unfolded the paper under the lantern light. The handwriting was sharp. "Mail. Mrs. Dawson, your late husband's debts remain unpaid. If you fail to send word of repayment, I'll have no choice but to collect what's owed by whatever means necessary. Don't think the West will hide you." The letter burned in Elias's hand. So that was it. She hadn't come here by mistake. She had fled. She'd used his name, his ranch, as cover. When he returned to the house, Clara was darning socks by the fire, her children already dozing around her. She looked up, saw the paper in his hand, and her face drained of color. "You went through my things," she said softly. Elias's voice was, "Elias, You lied to me. Clara laid the sock aside, her fingers trembling, though her eyes stayed locked on his. I didn't lie. I just didn't tell you everything. You brought trouble to my door. Debt collectors. Maybe worse. Elias's tone rose, sharp enough that Samuel stirred awake and sat up, glaring like a cub ready to fight a bear. I brought my children to safety. Clara shot back, her voice, usually calm, now cracked with steel. I buried my husband with nothing but bills and shame. Those men back east would have taken my children from me, sent them to orphan houses or worse. I came west because the agency gave me your name. It wasn't chance, Mr. McGrath, it was survival. For a moment, silence roared louder than any storm. Elias felt the weight of every scar on his soul pressing against hers. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to push her out that very night. He wanted both, and neither. Samuel stood, fists clenched. Don't you raise your voice at my ma again. Elias stared at the boy, saw in him the fire of his own younger self, and realized this house, his quiet, lonely house, would never be the same again. Clara's voice softened, but her eyes never left his. You asked for a bride, Mr. McGrath. Instead, you got me and mine. If that's too much, say the word, and we'll go. But know this, wherever I go, trouble will follow. Not because of me, but because life has a way of testing those who've already lost everything. The fire cracked between them. Elias said nothing. He couldn't. Out in the yard, the prairie wind howled like a wolf. Inside, a different kind of storm was only beginning. The following days blurred into a storm of tension. Clara Dawson kept her children busy, from dawn to dusk. Lucy sweeping, Samuel chopping wood, Ben running errands. He only half finished, but the house still rang with noise. Elias McGrath, once master of silence, felt like he was living inside a whirlwind. And yet, beneath the chaos, something had shifted. Clara cooked with a skill that filled the kitchen with warmth. Her biscuits golden, her stews rich with flavor. At night, Elias caught himself lingering in the doorway, listening to the sound of her voice as she read from a worn Bible to the children. But every time he remembered the letter, the threat from her husband's creditors, his chest tightened like a vice. Trouble was coming. He could feel it. It wasn't long before his suspicions proved true. Sheriff Carter Holt rode up to the ranch one morning, dust on his hat, his mustache bristling with irritation. Elias met him at the gate, unease gnawing in his gut. McGrath, Carter drawled, got strangers in town asking after a widow by the name of Dawson. Eastern men, hard-eyed, carrying themselves like wolves, sniffing out prey. They say she owes them money. Big money. Elias's hand clenched on the fence post. And you pointed him my way. The sheriff snorted. I ain't no postman, but they'll find her soon enough. Town ain't but a whisper wide. Best you decide whether you plan on keeping her under your roof. Men like that don't knock polite, they take. With that, Carter tipped his hat and rode off, leaving Elias with a weight heavier than the ranch's stone hearth. When he entered the house, Clara was kneading bread at the table. Her sleeves were rolled, flour dusting her cheek. She looked up at him, reading his face before he spoke. They're here, aren't they? She whispered. Elias didn't answer right away. He only poured himself coffee, the silence between them thick. Finally, he muttered. Sheriff says, men came asking for you, said UOM. Clara's hands pressed into the dough, her knuckles whitening. I told you already. My husband left debts. Debts I never agreed to. Debts I couldn't pay. Those men don't want money, they want punishment. They want to make an example of me. Elias's jaw tightened. And you dragged your young'uns straight into the storm. Clara's eyes flashed. I dragged them out of worse. You don't know what it's like to have nothing but hungry mouths and men pounding at your door. That cut deep. For a moment, Elias saw his own ghost, the fiancée he'd lost years ago. The life that had slipped through his fingers like water. He knew what it was to bury dreams. To wake with emptiness gnawing at your chest. But grief made him hard. Not soft. You should have told me the whole truth the first night, Elias said. His voice was gravel, low, and unforgiving. I was afraid you'd send us away. Clara's tone cracked, but her gaze stayed steady. And maybe you should have, but if you do now, I won't beg. My children will sleep in that wagon again, and I'll keep fighting for them, with or without your help. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. He sat by the dying fire, the letter burning in his pocket like a coal. Samuel passed him in the hallway, shoulders squared, eyes burning with suspicion. You planning to throw us out? The boy asked bluntly. Elias looked at him, startled by the challenge in his voice. Samuel wasn't a child anymore. He was a young man trying to carry burdens too heavy for his years. No, Elias said finally, the word surprising even himself. But I won't have men tearing down my ranch because of debts that ain't mine. Samuel's jaw tightened. We don't need you. We've gotten this far without anyone. The boy walked away before Elias could answer. But the words clung, sharp as barbed wire. 2 nights later, the storm broke. Elias was mending a fence by lantern light when hoofbeats thundered up the road. 3 riders, dark coats, the kind of men who carried city stink into the open prairie. They reined in at his gate, their leader's voice slick with menace. McGrath, we hear you've taken in a widow. Clara Dawson, she's ours. Elias stood tall, every muscle taut. Behind him, he felt eyes at the window, Clara clutching Emily. Samuel gripping the rifle. Elias had leaned against the wall. The leader tipped his hat mockingly. "Step aside, rancher. Don't get yourself mixed in business that ain't yours." Ilias's chest heaved. Memories of his lost bride cutting through him like a blade. He'd failed once before to protect someone he loved. Would he fail again? He rested a hand on the fence post, his voice low but steady. "This ranch ain't yours, and neither is she." The man's smile turned cold. "Then you just made yourself part of the debt." McGrath. The riders wheeled their horses and galloped back toward town, dust rising in their wake. But Elias knew this wasn't the end. It was only the beginning. Inside the house, Clara's face was pale, but her chin was high. "I told you trouble would follow," she whispered. Elias stared into the prairie night, his hand tightening around the post. For the first time in years, he wasn't just fighting for land or cattle. He was fighting for something he hadn't dared hope for: family. And he knew the shadows of Clara's past would soon force him to choose what kind of man he truly was. The night was unnaturally still. No wind, no crickets. Not even the cry of coyotes across the prairie. Elias McGrath felt it before he saw it, the kind of hush that only comes before trouble. He sat at the table cleaning his revolver, lantern light flickering across the worn steel. Clara tucked the younger children into their makeshift beds, humming soft to calm their nerves. Samuel sat near the door, clutching Elias's rifle with a grip too tight for a boy his age. He hadn't said a word all evening, but his eyes burned like embers when the first hoofbeats shattered the silence. Everyone froze. Elias rose slowly, holstering his gun. "Stay inside," he ordered. Clara's voice trembled. "Elias, stay inside," he repeated, more firmly. 3 riders emerged from the darkness, the same men Sheriff Holt had warned him about. Their leader, tall and sharp-jawed, dismounted with a grin that carried no warmth. "Well now," he drawled. "McGrath, you've had time to think it over. We'll be talking the widow and her brats tonight. Clear your conscience, and we'll let you keep your ranch." Elias stepped off the porch, boots grinding against the dirt. His voice was flat, dangerous. "You set 1 foot past this gate and you'll regret it." The leader's smile widened. Big words from a man who's been hiding from the world for years. "We ain't asking, McGraw. We're collecting." He gave a whistle, and the other 2 men rode toward the barn, intent on setting fire. Elias drew his revolver, the barrel glinting under the moonlight. "You'll light that barn, and you won't live to see it burn." The standoff hung thick as smoke, and then chaos erupted. One of the men struck a match, flinging it toward a pile of dry hay by the barn door. Flames caught instantly, climbing hungrily into the night sky. Cattle bellowed, thrashing in panic. The younger children screamed inside the house. Elias fired, the shot echoing like thunder. The arsonist toppled from his saddle, clutching his shoulder. The other outlaw drew his pistol, returning fire. Bullets cracked past Elias's head, splintering wood. Samuel burst from the doorway, rifle in hand. "Ma said stay," and Elias shouted, but the boy had already leveled the barrel and fired. The blast missed wide, but the sound was enough to scatter the horses, giving Elias cover. Clara appeared next, dragging water buckets with Lucy. "We can't let the barn go," she cried. Elias swore under his breath. They weren't just bystanders anymore, they were in this fight with him. The leader lunged at Elias, tackling him hard into the dirt. They wrestled, fists slamming, boots kicking. Ilias's revolver skittered out of reach. The outlaw's hands clamped around his throat, squeezing with brutal force. Spots danced before Elias's eyes. Then a wild cry rang out. Ben, mischievous, fearless Ben, came charging with a shovel, swinging it with both hands. The blow cracked across the outlaw's back, enough to loosen his grip. Elias rolled free, gasping air, and drove his fist into the man's jaw. The outlaw hit the ground, blood spilling from his mouth. Meanwhile, Clara and Lucy doused the flames with bucket after bucket, their skirts soaked, faces streaked with soot. Emily clung to Jacob, shielding him from sparks. Elias scrambled for his revolver, just as the wounded outlaw raised his gun to fire at Clara. Without thinking, Elias pulled the trigger. The shot rang sharp and final. The man dropped, lifeless. The leader, staggering to his feet, saw his partner fall and spat blood into the dirt. His eyes flicked from Elias to Clara, then to the children gathered close. "You made your choice, McGrath," he hissed. "You and that woman just bought yourselves a war." He staggered to his horse, hauled himself into the saddle, and galloped into the night, leaving the ranch smoldering, shaken but alive. When silence finally returned, Elias stood amid smoke and ruin, his chest heaving. His barn was scorched, one outlaw dead, another wounded, and danger far from over. But as he looked at Clara, her hair damp, her arms wrapped protectively around her children, something inside him shifted. He'd stood alone for years, convinced loneliness was safer than loss. But tonight, he hadn't fought for land or cattle. He'd fought for them. Clara met his eyes, her voice low and steady. "You could have let them take us." Elias shook his head, his voice hoarse but certain. "Wasn't never an option." The children clung to their mother, eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. Samuel, his hands still trembling from firing a gun, looked at Elias with something new, not distrust, but respect. And as the smoke drifted into the prairie night, Elias McGrath knew there was no turning back. He was no longer just a loner rancher. Whether he admitted it or not, he had a family to fight for now. The ranch smelled of smoke for days after the fight. Charred wood and scorched hay clung to the air, reminders of how close Elias McGrath had come to losing everything. The barn still stood, blackened at one end, but salvageable, thanks to Clara and the children's desperate bucket line. The younger ones bounced back quickly. Jacob toddled through the yard, giggling as though the danger had been nothing but a nightmare. Emily stuck close to Clara, wide-eyed but safe in her mother's skirts. Lucy, quiet and steady, took on chores without complaint, her small hands working far beyond her years. But Samuel kept his distance. The boy hadn't spoken since that night, not to Elias, not even much to his mother. He sat on the fence posts at dusk, staring at the horizon, rifle balanced across his knees like a man ready to defend a home he wasn't sure was his. Elias watched him with a pang he didn't quite understand. He'd seen that look before on himself, years ago, when grief had carved him hollow. One evening, as the prairie sunset bled orange and purple across the sky, Clara found Elias in the barn, mending a broken beam. Her sleeves were rolled, hair pulled back, a streak of soot still clinging to her cheek as though the fire refused to let her go. "You should rest," she said gently. Elias grunted. "Plenty of time to rest when the work's done." She stepped closer, her voice softer. "You risked everything for us." He set his hammer down, meeting her eyes. "Wasn't a choice. You're under my roof. I protect what's mine." Clara held his gaze, her lips parting like she wanted to argue, but didn't. She whispered, "We're not yours, Elias, not unless you want us to be." The words cut deep, not like a wound, but like a truth waiting to be spoken aloud. The following morning, Elias found Samuel in the pasture, checking the fence line. The boy stiffened when Elias approached, jaw set like stone. "You did good." That night, Elias said quietly. Samuel didn't look at him. "I missed my shot." "You stood your ground," Elias replied. "That's more than most grown men would have done." For the first time, Samuel's eyes flicked toward him, searching. Elias took a slow breath. "I know you don't trust me. I ain't trying to take your father's place. But I'll tell you this, boy, you and your ma, your sisters and brothers, you're safe here. As long as I draw breath." Samuel swallowed hard, fighting the emotion on his face. He didn't answer, but he nodded once, sharp and sure. For Elias, that was enough. 2 weeks later, Sheriff Carter returned with word. The outlaws had been driven from the county, the wounded one limped out of town, and the leader hadn't been seen since. Trouble might linger on the wind, but for now, Red Rock was quiet again. Judith Parker came by the ranch that same afternoon, arms full of pies and her tongue sharper than ever. She eyed Clara bustling in the kitchen, the children filling the table with chatter, and Elias looking more alive than she'd seen in years. "Well," Judith declared, hands on her hips, "if this ain't the sight I've been waiting a decade for. Took a widow with 5 youngins to bring life back into your bones. Elias McGrath." Elias nearly choked on his coffee. Clara hid a smile, cheeks coloring. Judith wagged a finger at him. "Don't you let her slip away, you stubborn fool. You've already got yourself a family, whether you admit it or not." That night, when the children were asleep and the house glowed with the soft crackle of firelight, Elias finally found his courage. He stood in the doorway of the spare room, where Clara sat sewing, her head bent over Samuel's torn sleeve. "Clara," he said, his voice low but steady. She looked up, the lamplight catching the weariness and strength in her eyes. "I sent for a bride because I was tired of being alone." Elias said, "What I got instead was you and 5 children I didn't ask for." He paused, his throat tight. "But I reckon God knew better than me. This ranch don't feel empty anymore." "Neither do I." Her sewing fell into her lap. "Elias," he took a step closer, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want a mail-order bride. I want you. And if you'll have me, I'll take your children as my own. All of them." For the first time since she'd arrived, Clara's composure broke. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks as she covered her mouth with one hand. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Elias, I'll have you." The next morning, as the sun rose golden over the prairie, Elias stood on the porch with Clara by his side and the 5 Dawson children tumbling around the yard. Samuel gave him a nod of respect before running off to help Ben mend a chicken coop. Emily's laughter rang out like bells. Jacob toddled after the dog, and Lucy carried water with quiet determination. For the first time in years, Elias McGrath smiled without hesitation. The loner rancher who once waited for a stranger's hand in marriage had found something greater, a wife who fought like steel, children who filled his silence with life, and a family born not of blood but of choice. And as the prairie wind carried their laughter across the wide land, Elias knew he'd never be alone again.